How do you go from journalist to author to activist to ambassador? Samantha Power talks about her new memoir, The Education of an Idealist. And how do you write a series of dark crime fiction set in a tiny town in Wyoming? Craig Johnson will be here to talk about his latest in the Longmire series, Land of Wolves. Plus, we'll talk about what we and the wider world are reading. This is the Book Review Podcast from the New York Times. I'm Pamela Paul. Samantha Power joins us now. Her new book is a memoir called The Education of an Idealist. Samantha, thanks for being here.
So happy to be here.
This is your fifth book in a way. You've edited 2 books, written 3, but your first memoir, which is obviously a very different thing. Why write a memoir now?
It was a different thing. It was an immensely challenging thing. All books are challenging in their own various dysfunctional ways, but this seemed to me the best way to open up a world that I think has become too cloistered, too inside baseball-y, with foreign policy people talking to each other or government people talking to each other. And because I had the luxury of having started my career as a writer and then become a diplomat and a government official rather than being a government official and then trying to learn to write in order to describe what had happened, I thought, maybe I can pull this off and just tell a really good story where people are swept along with the story, but as they go, they then understand the human rights crisis in the world, the refugee crisis in the world, and much more importantly, what one individual can do to try to deal with some of these issues. But I have to say, being Irish in our family, we repeated an old Irish saying, which is that you shouldn't even use the first person in therapy. And so to get the tone right and to not come across as presumptuous or putting myself at the center of events that other individuals were much more influential in, and just not seeming like it was a book all about me, which would be, in this time on this earth, such a bizarre thing to do, but to rather use my own story as a vehicle to get at these other issues. I definitely found it challenging.
How to keep the me out of memoir.
Yeah,
that's a bit of a hard challenge.
Exactly.
Did you have any kind of models in mind in terms of people who've written memoirs?
Well, I read all of them. I mean, not all of them, but one that really stood out somewhat surprisingly, I think, given what I was writing about and the kind of sometimes serious subject matter, was Andre Agassi's book, Open. And a lot of people have said to me, well, you're so open about your anxiety and about your fertility challenges and you're this and you're that. Well, I read that book and I thought, he has so brought me into his corner. I don't follow tennis that closely. I wasn't a huge Agassi fan growing up or anything like that. But he, by going so much inside himself and leaving that on the page. And also, the other way he influenced me, I think, was, even though it's nominally a book about his journey through the travails of playing on the tennis circuit, on one level that's such a superficial description of it, it's also a book about all the kind of the family he built along the way, the way he wasn't loved in the way that he probably wishes he was by his very demanding and driving parents, and he just picks up these individuals and they end up forming this base of support and this cocoon really of love for him. And I realized in reading that something very similar had happened to me. I'm very lucky. I was loved very well by my mother, who brought me here to America, with my stepfather who filled in for my father, who had died when I was young. But my whole rest of my family was in Ireland. And as I went, whether it was through picking up mentors or picking up a group of war correspondent friends, girlfriends who are all still my closest friends to this day, or even in government, the kind of solidarity that came from that, I realized sort of in reading his story, I said, wow, analogously, something very similar has happened to me, and I've just benefited so enormously because we're all so hard driving and we're moving. We're not necessarily reflecting on the architecture that makes what we're doing possible.
But you were in a position where you were the ambassador, obviously, to the UN, and you have to be so buttoned up and so careful about what you say and about what you reveal. And in this book, as you said, you're very open. I mean, you write about your infertility struggles, your father's alcoholism and his death, and how that affected you and your anxiety. Like, you didn't have to go there. Did you do that willingly? Was that difficult for you to write about those things?
It was really difficult at the start, and the parts about my family and my dad and my youth in Ireland in a pub in Dublin where I spent much of my first 9 years, that was particularly hard because I'm also a former reporter, so I had to go make sure I was reconstructing that as accurately as I could, because I also know memory from being a reporter that memory is a fallible piece of business. And so what was equally hard was actually going to my mother and going to my father's sister and the people who had been with him after we left and came to America, who had been with him as he deteriorated in the last years of his life. And I didn't know a lot of that. I mean, a lot of what's in the book about his final months and years came as a revelation. So there was that sort of off-the-page journey that I guess I went on in order to produce this, and this provided an excuse to ask questions, frankly, that I should have asked a long time ago, but I didn't want to drudge anything up or hurt anybody. And with the book, I kind of had an excuse almost to answer questions that had been lying unsettled in me. But the shorter answer to your question is, I'm back on a college campus now. I'm teaching young people. And what I started to see was it snuck up on me, A, that I'm so much older than my students, but B, that having been U.S. ambassador to the UN and a member of the president's cabinet, my story, as I describe it retrospectively, is not all that relatable for people. They think, oh, that's you. You know,
right.
You did that. You went off to a war zone. You wrote this book, and Obama found you, and you went and tried to help end the Ebola epidemic, and you. And because, to me, the best predictor of whether we take back our country and lead again in a humane way in the world is who comprises our institutions, who gets into public life, who is taking to the streets on guns or on climate or on anything else. Mm-hmm. I really wanted to use what happens to be my story, but to tell a story where people would feel they could relate to forging your ideals, trying to put them into practice, getting the crap knocked out of you at times and having to dust yourself off, but then also learning to navigate a messy world and a convoluted world at times, and ending up somehow amid everything, even with the 2016 election, even with climate change, but ending up more upbeat about one individual's ability to make change than I was when I entered government or entered public service. And so without the opening, I think it could just look like a wooden journey through my CV.
Right. Like, of course you got to do that, and you got to do that,
exactly.
And you got to do that.
And so to describe in publishing, my first book, getting 15, 20 rejection letters from different publishers. I mean, the number of writers who've come up to me since this Education of an Idealist has come out and said, oh my gosh, that gives me hope. Like,
welcome to our club.
Yeah, welcome to our club. And maybe if I keep going. And so just by showing the warts of it all, I think it makes it more real. And people are seeing themselves in those difficult chapters. I have a saying in the book that I got from Al-Anon, which is like AA, but for the children and family members of alcoholics, which I started to go to when I was living in Washington for the first time. And they had a saying that I'd never heard before, which is never compare your insides to somebody else's outsides. Mm. And what I realized for so much of
that would destroy Instagram.
Yes, exactly. I didn't think of it that way. But, everybody looks like they're strutting around. I'm sure here at the New York Times, like they all look like they got it together. But each of us is grappling with what's going on inside of us and our doubts about, are we doing it right? Is there a future for journalism? Am I making the cut? Am I balancing my desire to be home with my kids and to meet them at their Little League games and be there for them with my desire to hold our democratic institutions accountable? I mean, all of this stuff is swirling around in all of us. And a lot of writers who have the privilege of serving in public life don't make much of that transparent. And I think that there's a cost to that. I think people see it as more rarefied, these worlds as somehow for others inaccessible.
Yeah. Your trajectory from the outside, again, maybe to those students that you're teaching now, seems obvious to go from journalist to activist to author to advisor to ambassador. They're all starting with an A. But in fact, each of those transitions is really quite difficult. I mean, even to go from a journalist to an activist is like it's flipping a switch that it's almost difficult then to go back. And I'd love for you to talk about what it was. You were in the Balkans at the time that made you go from journalism to saying, okay, I can't just be writing about this. I need to do something else.
Well, the way I ended up there in the first place in the Balkans was actually opening up, as it happens, the New York Times and being confronted with the images of emaciated men behind barbed wire in Europe. I had learned a fair amount in high school in Atlanta, Georgia, and in college about the Holocaust. The idea of never again just seemed intuitive to me, not something I'd reflected much on. But here in Europe, there were these ghastly crimes being committed on ethnic and religious grounds. And luckily, my first job was an internship with somebody who'd worked in the U.S. government. I write about him in the book, one of my doers who I describe learning from in this education. And his name was Mort Abramowitz, and he processed the events in the Balkans and everywhere through a filter I'd never even entertained, which was, well, what should the United States government be doing about it? And this was the post-Cold War world, a much less multipolar world than we live in today. But
what year was this?
This was 1992, 93, basically. I saw the images in 92, and I began working for him at the end of 92. And so already I had that kind of question in my head. Just, again, when you're in your early 20s, it's your first job, you're pretty impressionable. And I myself wondered, given the suffering there, was there anything that I could do as an individual to be of use? And I first tried to get a job as an aid worker, but I had no skills. And as it happened, the place I was working was in the same building as U.S. News and World Report. And even though the world in the title of U.S. News and World Report was small, they had foreign correspondents and stringers. So I kind of marched in there and said, I'd like to go and be a stringer, a freelancer for you in the region. But again, my motivation had already been like, let me figure out how I can help someone. Okay, I can't do that. Maybe at least I can write about it and somebody else might read something powerful potentially that I write or see and then do something about it. So I had that instinct already. And then when I got there, totally contrary to the reputation that journalists have, especially in war zones, it was the most generous, welcoming community of fellow 20-somethings and early 30-somethings who had gravitated there for much the same reason. And the journalistic pack was criticized by some as being, that we were laptop generals telling the UN they should be doing this or that, or that we were backseat drivers and that we weren't sticking to the facts, but we were incredibly intent on finding the facts and exposing the facts. We just also were living among people who were getting targeted. And that inevitably, as a human being, is going to make you wish that somebody would come along and rescue those people, because we could leave. We had our press pass. We could get out of Sarajevo if a road opened or if a flight went. But everybody we were living with, they were completely besieged and trapped. And just to experience that was something. But as I went over months and years, and eventually I was the stringer for the Washington Post, which would have been a dream of mine starting out. I mean, to be able to write for President Clinton every morning. So I was thinking again already in that kind of who's reading and what are they going to do.
Right, so you were thinking about the people in power as opposed to they could actually change things as opposed to necessarily even just the readers.
No, yeah, I mean both, because I also was thinking, I wasn't a complete naif. I recognized the relationship between readers and their view of something and what a leader might do. And President Clinton was always on the cusp, and I just thought, well, maybe if I write the story of this girl who's been killed in a playground and how her sister's mourning her, and that something like that would just reignite a policy discussion. I mean, in a way, it was crazy in some respects. But as the time passed, and as I had the privilege of writing for one of the top 2 American publications and one of the most influential publications in the world, and people were still dying around me, I thought, I'm feeling like I'm mining them for their tragedies, and I'm getting on the front page of the Washington Post, and I could feel myself wanting to be on the front page,
right.
and the sort of ego of it, and I could feel myself also caring a great deal about how I was crafting my prose and feeling great pride and like, oh, I nailed the lead, and I just sort of had a moment, and it was after the very large massacre in Srebrenica where I said, I could go down this path. I'm heading down this path, but maybe I need to just take a time out and pull back. And I ended up going back to school, going to law school, in the hopes of trying to figure out whether there was also a different way, that I'd always be able to write. I mean, I was lucky to have really learned how to write quickly and to pull a story together while I was, on those terrible deadlines that we've all had. But it felt that maybe there was something more, that maybe to eventually be in a position where I could be reading someone's story, someone's powerful description of a playground massacre myself, that maybe that seemed almost more efficient.
That you could then be making the decisions.
Maybe. But it wasn't as, you look back and you draw all these dotted lines. Again, I was never so presumptuous to think that I would or that I could, but I could feel there was something in me that felt voyeuristic and that I wasn't quite at peace with the journey, with the track I was on.
So we're skipping over big chunks of that track. But in general, you went from these outsider kind of positions, journalist, activist, to then being very much on the inside and in positions of power as an advisor to Obama and as the ambassador. What was that transition like, to go from the one that's sort of constantly agitating then to be the one who has the people like you had been coming to you, trying to get you to do things, and then having to deal with more pragmatic considerations?
I think that I stayed the agitator that I had been. I don't think I changed much apart from learning the lingo and learning how the systems worked and basically trying to figure out exactly what maybe my fantasy might have been when I was in my early 20s, but which is, how do you take the same agenda you have, which put broadly in my case is, how do you integrate concern for human rights at the highest level of government? That was my agenda outside, pushing the government to do that. Now I'm inside. How do I get President Obama and his cabinet to be taking as seriously the human consequences of our decision as the economic consequences or the immediate national security consequences? So the agitator in me never receded, I don't think, in any real way. But it was very different when I would fail in government, when I lost an argument about, whether to do something. I knew that was the last meeting. I knew that there was no other, and there's certainly no other government in the world that was going to be contemplating, for example, initiating a resolution at the Security Council to send peacekeepers to a place to try to prevent sexual violence against women, or to launch a big initiative on preventing the recruitment of child soldiers, or even on questions about drone attacks and questions I might raise about whether it was appropriate on the basis of the evidence we had to be taking a strike, given that in that program there are real threats that are met in that way. But on the other hand, it's a vulnerable program because we are judge, jury, and executioner all in one room. And so that was me agitating. But when the meeting was over, there's no other meeting. You're in the meeting.
You're already at the top.
There's no other group of smart people meeting down the hall. And so I must say I took particularly my early inability to get something across the finish line hard. I learned that was just part of it. And I think one of the things I reflect on in the book is a number of people at one point called for me to resign, including John McCain and the Wall Street editorial board and a Washington Post reporter. And I tried to discipline myself to not just swat that away and say, oh, what do they know? They're just outsiders. But rather to say, look, that would, if I were outside, I'd probably be writing the same thing to this hypocrite who's written this book, and now she's defending our Syria policy. So I tried to step back with as much intentionality as I could muster to sort of ask, on balance, was I getting enough done? On balance, was President Obama not just having me there as a kind of human rights mascot, but were these issues that I was raising ones that he was taking seriously? And of course, when I did that calculation, I was incredibly privileged to be a part of, being his UN ambassador when he decides to go end the Ebola epidemic, and being part of mobilizing a coalition that saved arguably more than 1 million people because of his leadership, and then the empowerment of me and others to build this global coalition. I wouldn't have, if I'd left, I wouldn't have been a part of trying to get the Paris Agreement, which was negotiated in 2015, but rendered international law, which normally takes 8, 9, 10 years because of people's ratification procedures in their own countries, but to get that done before the November 2016 election so that if Donald Trump was elected, the entire Paris Agreement would not be unraveled. Our commitments, we knew, would be very vulnerable. And then just little things like getting political prisoners out of jail, or even on Syria, getting humanitarian aid to people who were in pockets that Damascus was not allowing to be reached. So I tried to pick myself up and acknowledge that there were inconsistencies with what I wanted or what I had believed before, but my beliefs really didn't change. My understanding of how to execute them changed a lot.
When you were getting criticized like that by John McCain, by the Wall Street Journal, I mean, you're a human being. It's interesting to hear that your first response was to sort of dismiss it. But how much do you take that to heart? And you've been so open in this book about anxiety and about the struggles of work and home and family. When you're in that high power position, does that kind of criticism get to you?
Totally. I never went through that phase of, I'll just dismiss it. Maybe it would have been adaptive to develop that thick skin, but I didn't develop in government. I think at this point, now that I'm out of government, it's probably too late. I'm who I am, and No, I read them. I took them serious. I mean, again, those were the kinds of things that I would have written before. So I never went through that. It was my father, for example, who's like, what have they ever done for anyone? And my husband would read me Teddy Roosevelt's Man in the Arena, the great speech, it's not the critic who counts, and the poorest way to engage the world is with a sneer. But they had a point, right? Which is that I had written so much about our responsibility in the face of mass atrocities. I did feel as though within the United States government that there was no shortage of attention to the human consequences. It was just President Obama weighing the human consequences to the Syrians and to the refugees and to the countries beyond Syria where the refugees were flowing into against the risk of an entanglement that would involve a different kind of human consequence for potentially for our soldiers and service families. And so I never felt unheard or myself dismissed, and I think that made it easier to go over it. But I mean, absolutely, it was hard, and it was hard as somebody who's tried to say what I mean and mean what I say pretty consistently throughout my career. Often I'd find myself at a podium, for example, at the UN, challenged on how a particular policy of ours could work. So, for example, Secretary Kerry took the lead on this, but with my support from the UN, in our last years, we tried to jumpstart a major diplomatic initiative in Syria to try to leave the country in a better place when we left than it was in. And I'd be at the podium and people would say, but I don't understand, where does your leverage come from? I mean, how do you expect this diplomatic play to work? Look what Russia's doing. Russia's backed Syria. They're using bunker-busting bombs and incendiary weapons. And they were right. There was a gap between our objectives and the means that we were deploying. Again, that doesn't mean that President Obama was necessarily wrong to confine our means in the way that he did, but it did mean that we could not achieve our Syria objectives, our stated Syria objectives. And so to be up there and to just feel that kind of the sort of hollowness, I open all of that up in the book. What is your head telling you? What is your heart telling you? What are the words that are coming out of your mouth? Because I don't get to make my own foreign policy. I'm part of a team. And again, in the vast majority of cases, when I'm at the podium, I'm talking with pride about the initiatives that my president is taking to forge an Iran nuclear deal or to curb our emissions so that we can take the lead globally on climate. But there are occasions that the price of being part of the larger enterprise is that there will be occasions where you feel that what you're saying is out of step with what's happening in the real world.
All right, another form of criticism, very different case. Can you tell the story about when you were on the phone with the Secretary General of the UN and one of your two kids, Declan, is trying to get your attention?
Some version of this was a recurring theme, and most working parents, probably men and women, will be able to relate to it. But it's just the usual thing that happens, except who I happen to be talking to at the time, but where your child comes up and they want what they want when they want it. And so he's coming up and he's, Mommy, and I'm like, I'm on the phone. And this is in the middle of Russia had just invaded Ukraine, and it was a real crisis time. We were having emergency meetings of the Security Council left and right. And he's like, Mommy, I need you. I'm on the phone. This is important, he said. And I'm like, this is important too. So eventually he gives up and he stomps off. And again, every parent can relate to the stomp, when our child just gives up on us forever in their minds. But in his case, as he stomps off saying, Putin, 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 Putin. When is it ever going to be Declan, 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 Declan? And I think he was like 6 at the time. And it sort of echoed and rattled around in my mind. And of course, one asks oneself, when will it be Declan, 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 instead of always Putin, Putin, Putin? And I spent a lot of time, again, in my thought bubble thinking about that as well and those trade-offs, because doing a 24/7 national security job and trying to raise 2 small kids, of course, every day presented trade-offs. And one of the themes of my book is this concept, not of lean in, which, of course, I believe in leaning in as well, but of lean on. Because there is just no way structurally that I could have done what I did without the nanny that we had who traveled with us to New York from Washington, and without my close friends, former Bosnia war correspondents who at the 11th hour would get the call saying, I'm totally screwed. I've got to be in the Security Council. Maria's away with her family, our nanny, and Mom and Eddie, my mother and father, who mercifully live in Yonkers. My mother's on call at the hospital. My dad's visiting his dog. Help! And there's no option of me not being there. And sometimes, my kids would be in the kind of antechamber off the Security Council, or they'd be in my office, and I'd have to move all the classified documents away because my 7-year-old and 4-year-old did not have top secret security clearances. So I had to be careful when they were in my office and so forth. So even though I'm writing about my experience by definition, I think there is something so universalizable about that juggle and the voices in our heads of kind of feeling like we're never doing anything quite at the top of our game, but we can't imagine trading off any part of it either.
So this is a memoir, but I have to ask you, I'm going to keep it to one question on Obama and one question on Trump. You met President Obama when he was still a senator. And, the thing that I think everyone wants to know when they meet anyone who worked with Barack Obama is, what's he really like? What's it really like? I'll spare you that question, but what do people not really get, do you think, still maybe about what things were like in the Obama administration, what it was like working for him?
Well, I think the most vivid portrait that I have offered that speaks to the part of him that I think people don't see as much is when I actually had to resign the campaign. I lost my temper, and in the heat of the primary battle in 2007, early 2008, I called Hillary Clinton a monster.
That must have been fun for you later on.
Campaign tactics. Yeah, right. Awkward. But what you'll see in the book, and that really people comment on because they're like, I didn't know Obama was like that, is that here he is in this dogfight, right, to try to get the nomination. And initially he says to me, I write to him immediately, I say, I've done this terrible thing. I'm so sorry. I know you're trying to run this different kind of campaign. I've completely screwed up. Don't worry about it. Things are, just know that nothing you say to a reporter is ever going to be off the record. Like, learn from it. I'm like, no, you don't understand. You might have to get rid of me. And he's like, don't worry. Anyway, it turns out ballooning into a much bigger scandal than he anticipated. I think I was more aware of where it was going at that point. So I ended up having to resign. He called me or emailed me pretty much every day for the next 2 months when I was sitting on the sidelines offering nothing. Not only was I offering nothing useful, it became a little mini cottage industry where reporters or interns, I hope, were going back over everything I'd ever said in my life and trying to affiliate it with Obama. So I was the gift that kept on giving. It was just awful. And yet one day he was going to Philadelphia to give his race speech, and his campaign it was a struggle at that point because these tapes kept emerging of Reverend Wright. And he literally, and I write about this in the book, and he tells me, hey, I hope you know we just conjured up this Reverend Wright scandal to take attention away from you, to divert. And this is, issues of such weight of family and the personal connections that he had, but also race in our society. And he manages to just be there for me. And I think, that, again, he's so calm and even-tempered, and especially in contrast with what we have today, that side of him is very salient, the reasonable man. The embodiment of just an intelligent adult who's going to hear all sides of the argument and try to make the best possible decision for the American people. But the heart in him and the care and the compassion that he showed, I think I show that side of him, and that played itself out in less friendly ways as well whenever he and I were arguing and I was agitating, to use your word, and he disagreed with me, but he knew that it would hurt people. That the decision, for example, I wanted to recognize the Armenian genocide, and he chose not to because of the relationship with Turkey, and yet we had promised that we would, and I found it very upsetting because we had promised, and I thought we could do it in a manner that would not harm our interests in the region, and had an idea for how. And he got so angry with me. So not Spock, much, much more hot-blooded. And I describe in the book, a number of occasions when internally he was so conflicted, and he knew that that there were these Armenian Americans who had campaigned for him, and that even though all things considered, he felt he had to make the decision he was making, his emotion would come forth when he felt particularly some kind of internal, almost moral conflict. And I found that on Syria as well, when that was when our relations were the most difficult and where we had the most arguments. And that's where the emotion that you don't see in him that he normally kind of channels would come out, because he was racked with questions about himself and whether there was a way to do something that could mitigate, the humanitarian catastrophe that was unfolding. And so when I would sort of remind him of the chemical weapons attacks. I quote in the book, at one point he's like, "We've all read your book, Samantha." In other words,
yes, yeah.
let's not admire the problem. Tell me how I can do something about that is not going to leave us entangled in the humanitarian catastrophe, but in fact will bring us to a place where we can, make a positive difference. And I was never able to come up with something that satisfied his criteria, but the tension, I think, speaks to his heart, really.
Okay, I lied. I'm going to ask one more Obama. It's an Obama/Trump question, because you mentioned earlier, last minute trying to make sure that everything is as secure as it can be before Trump comes into office. Was there any sense that he could possibly win? Like, was it a complete shock? And then once he did, how much could you actually do to make sure things were as secure as they could possibly be?
Well, probably the best answer I can give you as to how big a shock it was the idiocy of my decision on election night to hold an election party at the ambassador's residence with not only all the female ambassadors to the UN, there are only 37 out of 193 countries, knowing that they're thinking that there would be this coronation of the first American female president, and knowing what the cascading effects on women everywhere would be if that were to happen. Not only those women, but Gloria Steinem, Madeleine Albright, our first woman Secretary of State. I mean, it was going to be one hell of a party. And so that's how confident I was. To bring women together to be part of this, again, this coronation and to usher in a world of possibility for my daughter and for their daughters. I say in the book that when I sent my daughter off in the morning to school, she had one of those huge backpacks where it looks like it's going to topple her over, and then she's there at the election party, and she and my son, who was 7 at the time, and they both just keep saying to me, this isn't what you said was going to happen. And then the next morning, my son says, "You lied to me." I said, "Declan, it's going to be your first lesson here. I'm going to have to distinguish a lie from a mistake."
Yes.
I made a big mistake. And so it completely caught us off guard. But your question really was about then the period after, and we raced. My assistant sometimes would be in the elevator zipping up the back of my dress. I felt like I was racing out of the apartment. We wanted to try to get Syria through this diplomatic initiative in a better place. We did not. We desperately wanted to get a ceasefire in Yemen, where we were more complicit than any of the other Arab Spring situations, because we were supporting the Saudi-led coalition that was already proving it was incapable of shooting straight and putting in place blockades. And so diminishing our involvement, but also trying to broker something diplomatically. Again, we did not bring that to fruition. But I had also a personal list of female political prisoners that I had been trying to get out of jail for much of the last year and a half. It was a very short list, but in the end, we got 16 of those 20 women out of jail and were able to take advantage, I think, of the goodwill that Obama had accrued on LGBT rights, which was something that had never gotten attention at the UN. It was part of our mission to ensure that LGBT rights were seen as part of human rights. And we got that across the finish line. We also got the Security Council, which has Russia and a bunch of African countries on it, for the very first time to condemn the targeting of people on the basis of their sexual orientation, which is on one level just a piece of paper that comes out of the UN, but it's also potentially a weapon for LGBT people around the world to use against their own government. Hey, look, the Security Council is condemning this, and that includes Russia and the African countries. Now, how is it that you're targeting people on the basis of their sexual orientation? So we raced, and Paris was probably the best example of, that was actually before the election, of basically living by the precautionary principle of not acting as, believing Secretary Clinton was going to win, but not acting in a manner that would where you'd look back and say, oh, I wish we had those months again. So I don't think we left money on the table so much as, now the one counter to what I'm saying is, on the election interference itself from Russia, I think the thing we all have to ask ourselves is, was there a different way to jump up and down about that interference? We issued the statement in a totally apolitical channel through our intelligence channels. We had been given the signal by Mitch McConnell that there would be no appetite for anything bipartisan. And so we made the best calls, I think, given the circumstances that we could. But there's no way you can look at what's happening today and not look back and say, well, we clearly should have done something different because the election interference was very impactful. Millions of people got access to Russian-sponsored propaganda. The hacking itself put a story in the news that should have been a non-story in light of the events in the world that we should be focusing on. But it made a major difference. And so I think that's what I wish the current administration was focused on, is how do we ensure that that kind of multi-pronged attack on our democracy does not happen again. But instead, unfortunately, there seems to be some notion that maybe they will benefit from it again.
All right. Well, that brings us right up to today. We are recording this on Thursday morning, September 26th, the morning in which the whistleblower report has been declassified and released. This has been quite a week. You had tweeted, I think, yesterday, who thought it was a good idea, or Donald Trump thought it was a good idea to release this transcript as a staggering testament to the endemic corruption of his administration. He and his close advisors have lost the ability to even see what's incriminating. What do you make of all this now? I mean, now having seen the whistleblower report, and obviously this is a fast-moving train, but...
There's so much to say and so little time, but I mean... First of all, in the transcript or the memo of the conversation, you see so many things even beyond the leveraging of U.S. military assistance to a country in need, to a friend, on behalf of one's own political fortunes. You see, of course, what everybody's focusing on is the bullying and the, hey, you scratch my back, I scratch yours. And frankly, you see now part of a pattern of seeking the help of a foreign government to advance your own political prospects. We already saw that with Putin, and now we're seeing it with Putin's neighbor in Ukraine. But beyond that, and this is just personal, I think, to anybody who's been in the government, you see the trashing by an American president of an American patriot and civil servant, our ambassador in Ukraine. I happen to know her, but even if I didn't know her, this is somebody who, outside of the limelight, when I was in the government, I was a political appointee. I got to be in the Security Council, showdown with the Russians. I got a book contract, when I left the government. I mean, these are people who have served in these jobs, work their way up through the Foreign Service, and their only interest is serving the American people. They could have left when Trump came in because Trump had made clear his attacks on the deep state and his lack of interest in diplomacy and his desire to rip up every deal every foreign servant has ever been associated with. They didn't leave. Why? Because they understand, again, that the stability of our institutions and the service to our people goes beyond any particular leader and the whims of any particular administration. So that's just another feature of it. But I think the larger lesson is one that I saw when I cut my teeth in Bosnia, where we started this conversation, which is that of impunity. When someone who has gotten away with something that benefits them gets away with it, there is very little disincentive for them. There is only a belief that, well, if I did it once, I can do it again. And I think that the way in which the Russia allegations were handled, particularly by the Republican Party, had left President Trump feeling, hey, I've got my blocking coalition here. There's really no line I can cross where they will challenge me. And as long as I can keep my blocking coalition, I can get judges through the courts, I can rip up agreements that the Obama administration did that were in the interest of peace and trying to save the planet. I can do all that, but also I can take advantage of this office to aggrandize myself and to advance my own financial interests and to advance my own personal interests now in having a second term so I can further advance my financial interests. And until people who have the numbers in the Senate, because, again, there's only so much Democrats can do, decide that they care more about the office, more about the institutions, and more about the country than they do this individual and whatever devil's bargain they've made with him. This is an individual who feels complete impunity. And that transcript, that what the whistleblower heard, is a testament to somebody who feels that they can get away with anything.
Well, it feels a million miles away from the world described in your book. Samantha, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
The book, again, is The Education of an Idealist, a memoir by Samantha Power. Hi, this is Pamela. Every week you listen to us here on the Book Review Podcast, and now we want to hear from you about what you hope we'll do next. Please go to thebookreviewsurvey.com and tell us your thoughts. Whether you're a longtime listener or a new one, we want your feedback. So again, that's thebookreviewsurvey.com. Thank you so much. Craig Johnson joins us now from Ucross, Wyoming. His latest book in the Longmire series is called Land of Wolves. Craig, thanks for being here.
Hey, great to be here. Thanks for having me.
So you write about the West. You live in the West, but it wasn't always this way. You're sort of Wyoming by way of New York, by way of West Virginia.
Oh, a lot of different places. I had one of those like young adulthoods where, I don't know. You always think like you want to be a writer, and then you think, you need some experiences to draw from. And so I basically lived in a half-ton pickup truck traveling all over the country, living in different places and doing different things, just kind of like drawing, information from different places and different jobs and different cultures and all of that. And, in hopes that I was going to be a writer. But, wanting to be a writer in many ways is kind of like wanting to be an astronaut. The odds against you are so great that you might as well just not tell anybody. Because that way, if you succeed, it's a surprise. And if you don't, you won't embarrass yourself.
Well, so far you've succeeded. I think this is the 15th Longmire book.
It actually is. It sounds strange saying that, because it seems as though I started writing these books only yesterday. The first book in the series, The Cold Dish, was actually just a standalone book. It was just supposed to be a standalone novel, and it got picked up by Viking Penguin. And they said, we really like these characters. We really like this place. We really think that, that the potential is here for a series of books. And that is when I, with the knowledge of not even having had one book published, started arguing with Catherine Court, the president of Penguin USA, and saying, I don't think that'll work. I don't think that's a very good idea, but I've got some other ideas I want to bounce off of you. And she said, why don't you go back to your ranch in Wyoming and think about this? And so I did like that. And, it was something different, than what was a lot of crime fiction that was going on. Most of the crime fiction at that period in time was very noir. It was very urban. And I thought, okay, well, what if you were the sheriff of the least populated county in the least populated state in America? Wouldn't that, be something maybe a little bit more different? Maybe it would force you to deal more with character and place, which is where I think the best writing comes from. And I ran into two DCI investigators. That's a Division of Criminal Investigation here in Wyoming, where we have one crime lab in the entire state with only 500,000 people in it. And I asked them, I said, how long does it take you guys to get DNA evidence? This is that period in time when all the CSI stuff was really starting to pop, and it was all over the place. And I asked him, I said, how long does it take you guys to get DNA evidence? And they said about 9 months. And I thought, well, boy, that's just really not what's being portrayed in these TV shows or in these books, where they seem to get DNA evidence in about 2 to 3 minutes. And so I thought, maybe this would be something to try. And then I stumbled onto Walt Longmire, and that was the voice of the books and how they all kind of took off.
All right, well, let's go back to that rural setting, because that's very interesting. What else makes situating a mystery, doing rural crime, different from urban crime? What are the other challenges or maybe opportunities of having that kind of low-populated setting?
Well, first of all, you can disregard technology to a great extent, because
no one has cell service.
Yeah, it's kind of funny like that, because that's one of the things, since they've had the television series on Netflix, Longmire, that the question I get asked the majority of the time is, why doesn't Walt carry a cell phone? And my first response to that is always, you've never been to Wyoming, have you? Because, it's just the limitations of technology. We kind of go through our modern lives thinking that, the technology can save us in all different kinds of situations. And only when faced with the vast aspects of the American West, and other places in the world, do you really get to see the limitations, of that technology. It's not a solve all, for everything, and so it kind of speaks to a frontier kind of aspect of the books that even, is in the modern era, in the contemporary American West, that not only is it a geographic frontier, but an emotional frontier in the sense that, you're out there by yourself. You and I having this lovely conversation, in the studio, that is, one thing, and, me here in my living room. And another completely different conversation, if we're up in the Cloud Peak Wilderness area, at about 14,000 feet, and there's a blizzard coming in, and so it makes for a somewhat of a dynamic kind of environment, I think, for, these type of works. And it's a little bit different from what you normally hear.
One of the things that maybe is not as different from a lot of procedurals and crime stories and mysteries is, and I'm not saying he's not his own character, but Sheriff Walt Longmire, he's middle-aged, he's overweight, he's a Vietnam vet, generally not a recipe for happiness, and he's often depressed. And I'm curious, why do we like our detectives to be kind of beat down?
Oh, I think it's an everyman kind of aspect to it. I mean, that's one of the things I really can't stand, in that type of literature. Like it is the 6'2" of twisted steel and sex appeal. Every woman wanted him, every man feared him. He could kill anyone with a number 2 Ticonderoga pencil in 3.2 seconds. I hate that guy. And it might, I don't know, maybe one of the big reasons is it ain't what I see in the morning when I get up and look in the mirror. Maybe I'm just jealous or whatever, but it just doesn't seem real, that type of character. And I think, we all deal with, sadness and depression and all of the difficulties that go along, with any type of life. I tend to refer to Walt. That was a really good description. You sounded like me there when you were rattling that off. I tend to refer to Walt as overweight, overage, overly depressed. But the great thing about him though is that he gets up in the morning and tries to do the right thing, tries to to get the job done. And I gave him a couple of secret weapons, that give him a little bit of a level playing field. A couple of different things. He reads everything and he remembers it. That makes it for a formidable lawman to a certain extent. And then
what does he like to read?
Oh, everything in the world. There doesn't seem to be any limits. He came from that type of a family where being caught without a book was a little slice of hell. Everybody wants to carry the books around with them. And I think Walt's one of those too. And then the other thing I gave him was a sense of humor. I think that was another thing that was really kind of important to the character and maybe even the success of the series. And that Walt has a sense of humor. That's how he deals with that depression. That's how he deals with those difficulties in his life. And for me, that's what'll get you up the hill when nothing else will.
One of the things I would think would be challenging when you are writing about one lead character and you're on your 15th book is, to what extent does this guy stay the same? And to what extent is there an arc that transcends each individual book, so that are you seeing him grow, develop, maybe become more overweight or more depressed as the books progress? Or does he start anew with each book?
No, you're absolutely right, and you've hit the nail on the head in the sense that I think that's where a series either succeeds or fails. I think we've all started series where they start gangbusters and the characters are so interesting and there's so much going on, and then you get about 7 or 8 books in, and then all of a sudden it seems like the plots are being rehashed, the characters are doing the same things over and over again. I think that the development and evolution of a character is absolutely essential to any kind of a series. And Walt has evolved over these 15 years. When we first meet him, he's so clinically depressed from the death of his wife, the loss of one of the most important things in his life, that it's very difficult for him to continue on like that. And then as the workload continues and as his career continues and his concern for his community and for the law and all of these things, and it kind of brings him out of those doldrums. Not that he isn't going to get set back. In the last year's book, Depth of Winter, he really went through the ringer, and so after returning from Mexico, in the Land of Wolves, he gets back to Wyoming and is kind of a stranger in a strange land in many ways. The things that he goes through and the things he has to do while he's down in Mexico, they're not things that go away very easily. And so not only is he a stranger in a strange land, he's a stranger to himself.
Well, speaking of strangers in strange land, a very strange land for many writers is Hollywood. And as you mentioned earlier, Longmire, is now available on Netflix. It started off as an A&E show, was continued on for a few years through, I think, 2017, right? And now anyone can go on Netflix and watch it. What happened when the books became a TV show? Were you involved in that process?
I was involved with that process to the point where they actually sent me the DVDs of the auditions for the actors that they were considering. And the funniest thing that happened was my wife and I were watching the DVDs for the auditions, and Robert Taylor, the actor who plays Walt Longmire, came on, and my wife was sitting here with me in the kitchen, and she goes, "Oh my!" And I turn around and look at her, and she goes, "He's handsome." And then she makes it even worse. She says, "He's kind of like a TV version of you, taller, better looking, with a better voice." So I'm not as big of a fan of Robert Taylor as I used to be, I have to admit.
Well, that's what happens to a middle-aged, overweight character when they, go on the big screen.
That's right.
What was it like for you to see your characters on screen, to see the stories play out, and did that affect the way that you approach writing the books?
Well, the only way I can describe the experience is it's kind of like, having a house plant in your house for about 7 or 8 years and then coming down one morning and having it start talking to you.
Right.
It's kind of odd, but kind of wonderful too at the same time like that. And no, it really didn't have too much of an effect on the writing process, I have to admit, because I'd already been writing the characters for about 7 or 8 years, and one of my favorite quotes about writing is the one from Wallace Stegner where he says, the greatest piece of fiction ever written is the disclaimer at the beginning of every book that says nobody in this book is based off of anybody alive or dead, and what a crock that is, because that's your job, to go find interesting people and put them in your books. And so, a lot of the characters are based off of, family and friends and, and people that I know very intimately, and so it would be kind of difficult for actors to, subvert that, and have an effect on that. But it's kind of wonderful because they've all become, very, very close friends, as a matter of fact. They all come to here, Buffalo, Wyoming, for Longmire days, and they're all going to, be with me on tour, out in Los Angeles at the Writers Guild Theater, and it's been a really kind of a wonderful experience. A lot of authors, I think, are at least partially responsible whenever they have bad experiences with Hollywood, because I think the expectations that they have are sometimes unrealistic. And so I kind of went into this, with my eyes open, and then the wonderful producers and everybody that I worked with in doing the television show were just, marvelous to work with. And they really, wanted to capture the tone of the books and the feel of the characters. And it really kind of came through. It worked very, very well.
So for those of us who do not write mysteries, it's kind of a mystery how it gets done, or at least it is to me. I mean, do you know the ending before you start every time? Do you know, okay, well, this is where this is going? And how do you start?
Oh, you bet I do. I don't ever start a book without knowing where it's going to go and where it's going to end up. I mean, one of the things I do is I have a cyclical kind of aspect to the book. So the way the book starts is the way the book ends. There's a pattern to that, And then the other thing is I like to think that, what I write is socially responsible, crime fiction. I mean, I'm not looking to just stack bodies up like cordwood, to get you to turn pages. For me, I'm trying to say something. I'm trying to get a message across.
What's your message?
So, it differs with each book. I mean, each book is going to have a different issue, to have to contend with. I mean, the title of Land of Wolves comes from an old Basque proverb that a land of strangers is a land of wolves. We do deal with the issue of wolves, within the book, and a number of different layers like that. But, a lot of it has to do with that aspect of, being a stranger to yourself. I mean, when you go through, certain things in your life, you're no longer the person that you were. And sometimes the person that you've become doesn't want to go quietly into that dark night. They want to stick around like that. And sometimes that person might have a few rough edges you have to contend with.
Do the plots just come to you, or is it an excruciating, difficult process in which you're trying to figure out who did what and how did it get discovered?
No, it's actually pretty easy. I use this one, really great, shortcut. It's called newspaper articles. I read a lot of newspapers, and generally what that does is it's a launching point, for a lot of the storylines, because what that does is it allows me to deal with contemporary Western issues, that the Wyoming sheriffs are dealing with. I mean, the worst thing in the world would be for me to write books where Walt's on a cruise ship or Walt is trying to learn how to skateboard or something like that. I mean, I want Walt dealing with the things that, that Western law enforcement deals with. And so those newspaper articles kind of do that. And then, they're so outrageous. I mean, the stories that you get, are so absolutely outrageous. I mean, there was one that I got, from a sheriff's deputy here only a couple of weeks ago that's going to end up being the Christmas story that I send out, from my website. It was about a guy who got the bright idea that he was going to get his family 23andMe DNA kits for Thanksgiving, and they would all open them on Christmas. Well, the results didn't turn out quite the way that everybody thought they would. And so it ended in a domestic situation. The sheriff's deputy had to go there and kind of break up some fights like that. But I mean, there's so much going on out there to work with. And I mean, and that kind of goes back a little bit, I think, to that emotional and cultural and social frontier, that it's not the same people going to the same jobs from the same houses and the same car type of thing. I mean, it's a little bit of a different world, and that's always fun to illustrate and give to the readers as a gift.
Well, we give you crimes and obituaries, and you give back with with those stories. Craig, thank you so much for being here.
Absolutely my pleasure, Pamela. Thanks for having me.
Craig Johnson is the author of the Longmire series, which is both books and TV available on Netflix. His latest is Land of Wolves. Joining us now to talk about what we're reading, my colleagues Elizabeth Egan, Jumana Khatib, and John Williams. Hey, guys.
Hey, Pamela.
Hi.
All right, John, let's start with you.
I've been talking about so many old books lately that I thought I would talk about something new to prove that I read contemporary books as well as older ones. And I really greatly enjoyed recently on vacation a book called Night Boat to Tangier by Kevin Barry, the Irish writer. It was the first book of his that I've read. It's a new novel. It goes very quickly. It's written almost in long stretches like a script of dialogue between these two guys, Charlie and Maurice. And they are two older guys who are former drug runners, maybe current drug runners. They've had they've been longtime partners in a dangerous world. And they're sitting in this boat station in Spain waiting for, they hope, Maurice's daughter to show up, a young woman who is estranged from her dad. And what it really is, I think the publisher itself called it this somewhere, and I did unknowingly. Maybe I should be a publicist instead of an editor, but it reminded me of a combination of Waiting for Godot and the movie In Bruges. I don't know if you guys have seen that.
Yes.
Colin Farrell and he's so great, the other guy. I can't remember his name. Oh, he's so fantastic too.
Face.
Yeah, he's got a great face.
That guy.
So hopefully they'll be cast in this, although Farrell's a little young. The other guy would be perfect. So, they banter and they're witty with each other. But the book also opens out onto their past and these episodes that they recall of their earlier jobs and some of the grim things they've been through. And, they're not particularly likable in terms of what they've done on paper, but they're good company. They're very funny and, probably unrealistically witty in a way. But Barry's great at the back and forth. And it's got a sentimental streak about 3/4 of a mile wide, I'd say. But he pulls it off. Dwight Garner reviewed it very well for us if people want to go online and read that review to learn more. And because I like that so much and I hadn't read Barry before, I then picked up this novel of his from a few years ago called Beetlebone, which is a strange book because it's about John Lennon trying to visit this Irish island that he apparently bought and then wanted to escape to and do primal screams on to relieve his stress. And I'm about halfway through, and so far he's employed this guy to try to get him to the island, and they kind of can't find it, and he's trying to outrun the press, and he's staying at these strange little hotels. It's not working as much magic for me as the new novel, but it's good, and I know that about 3/4 of the way through it's going to change, and Barry is going to make an appearance, and it's going to sort of turn into nonfiction for a little bit, which is strange but cool. So Kevin Barry, I would definitely recommend dipping into his stuff. Jimana, what are you reading this week?
Okay, so a few weeks ago, I went to the Strand to pick up The Sea by Iris Murdoch because I'd never read anything by her, and I got waylaid when I saw on the shelf one of her other novels called A Severed Head. And I don't know anybody who can pass up a book with that title. I didn't know anything about it. Well, even nonfiction, I don't judge. Listen, you can learn something. So it's an incredible book. It's very Freudian. It was written in the 60s, as we're sort of tipping toward whatever kind of sexual revolution happened in Britain. And it's about a man with a much younger mistress, and his wife leaves him for her analyst. And then there's some wife swapping that goes on, and he falls in love with the analyst's sister. I don't want to I'm not ruining anything. This all happens in the first 40 pages. Mm-hmm. And it is so riotously funny. And I don't necessarily love reading about British people of low morals, but this is turning out to be wonderful. So I can't recommend that highly enough.
Yeah, well, you have to go back to The Sea after that. That's such a strange and also a great book.
So why don't you like reading about people of low morals? To me, they're the only ones to read about.
Oh, well, you know what? I think I just get worried that it's a cautionary tale. If you're not careful, you're going to backslide into madness and ill repute. So anyway, virtue. So how about you, Liz? What are you reading this week?
I've been on a little bit of a memoir jag this week. I read two very different memoirs and loved both of them. The first is Demi Moore's memoir. It's called Inside Out. And it's the story, it's a chronological story of her life, beginning with her very, very traumatic and transient and difficult childhood as the first child of two teenagers. Basically, she raised herself. She had unimaginable trauma and abuse and loneliness, and it's a story of how she pulled herself out of that world and into the world of Hollywood. And I think of Demi Moore as someone who, she's sort of the Forrest Gump of my adolescence. When I think of anything big that happened in my life in my teens and 20s, I can pair a Demi Moore movie along with it, from St. Elmo's Fire to About Last Night
Ghost?
to Go. I loved Ghost.
I loved Ghost so
loved
much when it
G.I.
came out.
Jane. I loved A Few Good Men. And the book takes us through the growth of her career, but also really behind the scenes into her marriage with Bruce Willis and what she was thinking at the moment when Annie Leibovitz took the famous picture of her pregnant that appeared on the cover of Vanity Fair. And also into the darker days of her career and her adult life when she became known as Gimme Moore for asking for higher amounts of money for her later films, money that I would argue she had coming to her.
Yeah, for sure.
Definitely.
And it's just fascinating to go behind the scenes with someone whose face you know and think you understand, but to find out what was really going on in her life at the time. So I appreciated her honesty. The book is beautifully written, and it feels very honest and memorable.
I think she worked with Ariel Levy, the New Yorker staff writer.
Who's one of my
She's a really good
favorite
writer, yeah.
writers.
Incredible, yeah.
And she did an amazing job.
It's great.
When Andre Agassi's memoir came out years ago, the person he worked with, J.R. Mooringer, got tons of props for just creeping inside Agassi's skin. And I think that that's exactly what Ariel Levy did here.
Interestingly, earlier on the show, Samantha Power talked about Agassi's memoir as being a kind of
It's the gold standard.
yes, yeah.
Oh, that's interesting. While
Yeah.
she was writing her book, she
That
And
was
did you
her.
read
Wow.
The Tender Bar?
No.
J.R. Moore.
No,
oh,
no,
it's
I
so
know.
good.
That's
It's
one
a
of those
must.
books.
As you can see, I'm a memoir junkie. But the other memoir I read this week is written by someone who is not a Hollywood star and was thrust into the public eye in a very brutal way. Her name is Chanel Miller, and she's known to the world as Emily Doe. She was the victim in the notorious Stanford rape case, whose victim impact statement was published on BuzzFeed and had within, I believe it was 4 days, had 11 million views. So chances are you might have read it or heard about it. And her memoir is called Know My Name. And it's a, moment by moment account of what happened from the night that she was raped after going to a fraternity party at Stanford, through the court case, through her time living a double life. She told very few people, including at first, she didn't tell her employer, she didn't tell her parents what had happened. And so she was leaving work to go to these appointments with lawyers and doctor's appointments, and you really get a sense of the incredible trauma that she survived. But what spoke to me the most about this book, which I also plowed through in one night, it contains a really powerful theme of sisterhood, because her sister Tiffany was with her at the fraternity party at Stanford. In fact, she sort of ended up, she was there as a joke at first because she was 22 and out of college, and she just went along with her sister. And it's the story of how the two of them stick together through everything that happened, and how she finds solace in writing and art as she's going through her recovery. And the thing that became very clear to me as I was reading is this is a person who would have published a book regardless of whether or not she went through this trauma. This woman is a born writer, and I got goosebumps as I was reading. It's incredibly poetic and beautiful. I highly recommend it. Pamela, over to you.
Same thing, 2 memoirs, also a little bit on a memoir streak, but very different books. One book I read, finished recently, is called The Dirty Life, a memoir of farming, food, and love by Kristen Kimball. And I read the book because I had gone to a publishing lunch for the author. She has another book coming out later this fall that's called Good Husbandry. And one thing that I find key in a memoir, which is that just the right mix of seeing yourself in the author and then absolutely not seeing yourself in the author at all. And so the part, so I think like 5% of me could see myself as her in that she was a travel journalist, she was a freelance writer, she was a vegetarian, and she went out to do a story about this farmer, and like within hours found herself slaughtering a pig beside him, and I think they ate it like the next day, and she fell in love, and they got married and built a farm together, and then went on to have children. And I think that's sort of where she picks up in the second memoir. So about 5% of me would want to do that, maybe less than 5%, like 3%. And I don't want to eat the pig at all, though I do miss bacon. But there's something about that life on a farm where she is completely immersed in nature, and they grow everything from maple syrup to, full range of animal livestock. It's a dairy farm. They have vegetables. They have fruit, which is apparently, according to anyone who knows anything about farming, and that does not include me, really challenging to do. Like to be a farmer of anything, just one thing, is a tough life right now. But to make all of this, you're essentially working from dawn till dusk. So that's like the 95% of me that wants nothing to do with it. However, really enjoys reading about it. And she writes about it really well because she was a writer before she was a farmer. And just these incredible stories of things that I, again, had little knowledge of. For example, when you have a dairy farm and a cow, I don't even know the proper terminology, I guess a sow has a baby, has a calf, you need to immediately separate the calf from the mother, because otherwise the calf will drink all of the dairy milk. He'll take up too much of his fair share. So you sort of drag the calf away, and then the mother is just sort of like looking around at the spot where the calf was, just like, I thought I put something there that meant something to me. And, for sort of 24 hours seems to be very mournful, and then kind of moves on. But you, as the farmer, need to then go and milk the cow and get the colostrum, that sort of first really important milk for a baby, and get it out of the cow and bring it to the calf. So you and, whoever else is farming with you sort of become the surrogate parents for this new calf who, basically never sees mom again.
I'm never drinking milk again.
So I read that and really enjoyed it. And then the other book I read, I mentioned recently, the comic book artist Lucy Knisley, and I'm just now determined to read everything that she's written. So she once again got me to read about something I had zero desire to read. The first one that I had read was called Kid Gloves, which is about pregnancy and early parenthood. And again, I have no interest in that, having gone through it. And then the other book that I read this week, I still haven't read her first one, which is called Relish, so that's next. But this book is called Something New, Tales from a Makeshift Bride. And again, having written a book about marriage and weddings like a long time ago, I have no interest in the subject, couldn't care less. But she's so talented. It's such a brilliant book. I can't recommend it enough. And there was some news this week that she announced, again, I think I saw it on Instagram. She's really the one writer that I discovered 100% through Instagram, that she is making a book next about her cat, Linny. And I'm obsessed with this cat. So I'm very, very much looking forward to that book, which won't be out, I think, until 2021. But that's it. Let's run through the titles again. John, what did you read?
I read 2 books by Kevin Barry, Night Boat to Tangier and Beetlebone.
I am reading A Severed Head by Iris Murdoch.
I read Inside Out by Demi Moore and Know My Name by Chanel Miller.
And I read Something New, Tales from a Makeshift Bride by Lucy Knisley, and The Dirty Life, a memoir of farming, food, and love by Kristen Kimball. All right. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Pamela.
Thanks, Pamela.
Remember, there's more at nytimes.com/books. And you can always write to us at books@nytimes.com. I write back, not right away, but I do. The Book Review Podcast is produced by the great Pedro Rosado from Headstepper Media, with a major assist from my colleague John Williams. Thanks for listening. For the New York Times, I'm Pamela Paul.